Hi everyone, my name is Sandersan Onie, and today I'm going to be giving a talk titled Open Science in the Global South, Engaging Local Researchers. I'm really excited to be able to share about my experiences and my viewpoint on this matter, especially in today's event organized by Riot Science Club. And there are so many different voices here on diversity and the nature of open science really being open. So I'm really excited to give you my talk. Now, first and foremost, one of the things we have to understand is what we consider developed research systems, or at least the countries, the networks, the systems that typically have a few more researchers and are more connected, only come from countries comprising about 20% of the global population. And what we consider academic science in the most common format typically comes from countries like the US, Australia, and, well, not a country, but a lot of Europe as well. And so what does this typically mean? And just to be really clear, developed in this case doesn't necessarily mean better, because a lot of the practices that lead to reproducibility issues are probably more ingrained in these cultures. Now, one of the ways that I can think about it is, if you might have seen this film called Maze Runner, I can't remember when it came out, is that these young boys and girls found themselves inside this large maze. And every so often they would venture out into the bit of the maze, but they had this center that they had. But the entirety of the first movie was that they had no idea of the worlds around there. They played with each other, they spent time with each other, they engaged with each other. And often, because of the research systems that we typically engage with only comprise of 20% of that, it makes me think that maybe we're the ones at the center of the maze. There's an entire world out there when it comes to research, open science, all these things that are untapped that we have no idea what's happening, because what's happening and what's important versus what's given exposure may be rather different. Another way that I can think of it is that if you had a car with 6 cylinders, and open science tries to improve the performance of the cylinders, let's generate better science, let's make it more efficient, and so on and so forth. But imagine if you're only firing on one cylinder. No matter how well that cylinder fired, you're still missing out on massive potential. And I'd argue that in the same way, if we want research to develop, we have to include the other 80% of the world. And so there are a lot of challenges and opportunities in the Global South. For example, there's extreme heterogeneity due to developing at different times and from different starting points. Each country, I'd like to suggest that each country in the Global South has their different research history. And say if you did research in Europe or the US or in Australia, you'd find they're a bit more similar than what you'd encounter in terms of policies, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of rules and history and culture when it comes to research in a lot of the countries in the Global South. For example, and where I'm from in Indonesia, they only instantiated research quite relatively recently, within the last decade or so. And so when it was first instantiated, there are a lot of professors who'd never published in their entire lives. And there was this mad scramble to try to get as many publications out as possible. And I know that a lot of countries in the Global South, according to my research, are in similar stages where there's a sudden push, there's a sudden focus on quantity and prestige. But a lot of countries are in different stages of that. There's a lot of centralization and resources of decision making, where a lot of these countries have universities, and these universities aren't given the same autonomy in many of the more developed research cultures. And so what happens is the government, wanting to have more research or wanting to instantiate these new policies or instantiate this new culture, will suddenly implement these really stringent rules. For example, going back, I use a lot of my own country as an example because I work most closely with them, is that as of 2012, there was this government decree saying that every single student, whether you're taking your bachelor's degree or undergrad, taking your master's degree or PhD, you must publish, even the undergraduates. And so there's often a centralization of resources and decision-making to government. And so that being said, career and monetary rewards have even more value in these sort of contexts, especially since in these countries, sometimes researchers aren't paid as well. And so if you're told, and if you're paid lower than a lot of the researchers in other countries, or even a lot of the occupations in that same country, and suddenly you said, all right, you get a lot of money by publishing papers, suddenly there's a shift towards that as well. As I mentioned, recent introduction of policies and practices with mandate research output based on quality and prestige can significantly affect the culture and dynamics within that country. And a lack of ingrained research culture and sudden introduction of publication pressure can result in creative practices. For example, this is people can start using paper mills, people can start using the same data set and try to milk it as much as possible. Of course, there's nothing wrong with doing that ethically, but sometimes there may be a few unethical practices. Because there are a lot of senior academics who might not have experience in research, and in a lot of these cultures, there's a lot of respect. There's a culture of respect is demanded. But there's a lot of gift authorships as well. And so, but this is what happens when you suddenly have a lot of pressure and less resources. People tend to get a bit more creative in how they do things. And as mentioned, paper mills, mandatory gift authorships, uploading students' assignment into archives so it's indexed in your Google Scholar is another one that we've encountered. There's a lack of basic science infrastructure in many regions. For example, libraries in Nigeria they struggle to fill the libraries with modern technology and with papers. There's a lack of interconnectedness between countries. Collaborations, researcher exchange, and networks are far fewer in the Global South because they don't have a seat in the table of what we consider traditional academia a lot of the time. And what's interesting is that opportunities research culture is in a labile state where it's kind of like clay. It's not fully set yet because it's recently introduced and there's a lot of dynamic things happening at the same time. And I'd suggest this is an opportune moment. It's a critical time, and it's much more amenable to changes and creative ideas. For example, China and the cash for publication system, they recently changed their policy to take that back, and they can still, and I'll suggest that this is the time to do these sort of changes because the research culture is still labile before it's set. And country-specific ranking systems, where we see in some countries in Latin America as well as Indonesia, they have specific within-country ranking systems that they've introduced, within China as well. Now, I recently had the opportunity to write an article about what's happening in the Global South, redesign open science for Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Please do have a read. I did quite a bit of research and hope it offers some insight. But today we're not going to be able to go through the whole paper. We're only going to go through a little bit of it, which answers the question, what can we actually do? So researchers in the Global South are best equipped to tackle problems in the Global South. Thus, we need to empower them to lead and realize the changes that need to happen. So we cannot, and we must not, in our endeavor to make science better, work on them rather than work with them. And them, I mean talking about Global South, which I'm very much a part of. But I've had the amazing opportunity to meet these researchers in the Global South, and they are some of the most brilliant people I've ever met. But often what happens is people go in and try to instantiate things. And that's not the way it's going to work, because there's so much great and existing research and work and efforts that are already there, but simply they don't have the media coverage. As I mentioned at the beginning, what's highlighted by the media, what gets prestige, as we know, may not necessarily be important, or not even in the media in our mainstream open science circles. And here's a reason why we should include them. Again, there is so much work already been done that doesn't receive attention. When I hear the stuff that's happening, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is far above and beyond. While a lot of countries in developing research systems are even struggling to get senior researcher buy-in, countries in the Global South have been invited by government to write government policies. And a lot of the work is done to the Global South, not with them, and don't accurately capture the situation of what's happening. For example, there's a study of conference proceedings in Southeast Asia, which only indexed English papers. The author, it was actually a really, really great piece, but one of the shortcomings I found is that the author would only index English papers when looking at patterns in Southeast Asia, where English isn't the predominant language a lot of the time. This is actually pointed out by one of my colleagues, Dasapta Erwin Irawan, absolute legend. Another thing found by Nunes and Amano, so Tetsuya Amano gave this wonderful talk that IMOS alongside me last year, and he had this incredible study where he found that, hey, when you include only English-speaking literature searches, English papers versus non-English papers, you actually get diverging results. This is crazy, especially when a lot of us consider reviews as the gold standard for data or the gold standard for evidence. We actually get different results as when we discount what's actually happening in the global south and in different languages. And we have to come to terms with that. A lot of what we consider groundbreaking and forefront may not be so. A lot of our suggestions and ideas may not be new and may already be implemented, especially given how small our circles are. Remember, 20% of the population. There's so much out there that we have no idea is happening, and I can't go through all of them today. Another thing is research interests. What would shape the course of open science differ from one region to another? For example, in Indonesia, there's a huge focus on open access. Why? It's culturally ingrained that everyone deserves to have knowledge. It's part of our culture. It's how our country developed. And so when I go in there and I say, you know what, open data is really important. Pre-registration is really important. They'll be like, yeah, this is really, really important, but we want to focus on open access at the moment. So open science, there's so many different aspects to it. Open scholarship, there's a lot of different aspects to it. Each region is going to develop quite differently because there's so many factors that come into play, especially inherent cultural beliefs. And for example, a lot of our initial open science suggestions in social sciences came from experimental studies. And in a lot of the global south, they do a lot of different types of studies as well. So this is just an example of how open science will develop differently, because the experiments, the studies that birth open science come from different types of studies. There's different decision-making and political buy-in, where with a lot of these countries that just instantiated new policies promoting prestige and quantity, there's a different way of engaging them in order to get them engaged with open science. And for example, one of the opportunities that we have, we were invited by the Director General for Higher Education to include open science and open access policy, a policy brief into the updating policies of how researchers are evaluated in Indonesia. And I went to our researchers and I said, you know what, I really think we should do so and so. This makes perfect sense. And then one of my colleagues said, Sandy, that's never going to work. Even if it makes perfect sense to us, the situation may be a little bit different there. Again, pathways to policy making, each government structure, especially if it's centralized, is going to be a little bit different. And past events might accept acceptability of open science behaviors. There was this bit of a kerfuffle where in the past, Indonesia was trying to push to get into international journals. And they were trying to create journals as well. And they saw preprints and open access as a hindrance to that, where they believed that if people started putting things up on preprint servers, then they wouldn't be as motivated to publish in international journals or even to develop their own journal infrastructure. And so they saw open access as a threat to their plans, whereas in reality, it's not the case. And one thing that we have to understand is that they're deeply passionate about doing good science. 2 years ago, some colleagues and I had this idea, working together with the Center of Open Science, that let's create a webinar to introduce open science on a larger scale in Indonesia. And the researchers aren't compensated as well for their research. They're mainly compensated for teaching and not really for professional development. What we found is that we had viewing parties, this was pre-COVID, and we ended up having over 1,000 researchers. In fact, I think about 1,400 signed up. And we had over 33 different institutions from all the way from the east to the west, to the north to the south, to even rural Indonesia, participate and learn about good science. Participate and learn about open science. They're deeply, deeply passionate, despite some of the challenges that they're facing that we can't even imagine. So that was the whole argument. We need to include researchers from the global south. So how do we actually do this? Now, we need to foster relationships with existing leaders, and where possible, truly understand their efforts rather than just checking a box and seek to collaborate. An example of this is for language, for context and implementation purposes. An example I can think of in open science is that a couple of years ago, Indonesia was cited by one of the surveys by Nature, if I'm not mistaken, as the leader in open access worldwide. And that's where a lot of Indonesian open access got attention. Whereas I know there are some key players that have been working on that for years and years and years. That was actually happening. It was already there, but people didn't know about it. And so we need to foster real relationships, mutually respectful relationships, and truly understand their efforts and the way of thinking and what they're doing, rather than just go, hey, let's collaborate and come together. And also, when designing multi-country projects, ensure you have regional voices, not simply just global north versus global south, but understanding the different regions need different representatives. Because, say, the research culture in Indonesia is going to be extremely different than the research culture in Malaysia, even though they speak similar languages, even though the food might be similar. Sorry, that's a bit irrelevant. But even though it seems to be similar on the surface, they are very, very different. There's this large global network that was proposed quite some time ago with all these different people. And they had this really, really big steering committee. And it was a really great effort. But when I looked at the steering committee, there was hardly anyone from Southeast Asia, despite the heterogeneity and the need for open science in the region. And it's absolutely not because there's a lack of players. And so on that note, one of the things that came to mind is, and I should have mentioned this earlier, sometimes when we use the word global in science, especially if we're based in the US, parts of Europe or in Australia, it kind of like is a rock band doing a world tour, where they say, we're going on a global world tour. And where do they go? US, Europe, and Australia. That's not the globe, and we have to come to terms with that. What else can we do? We can use creative means to help address challenges in the region. For example, one of the things in Indonesia is that there's hardly any research funding. And for those of us in psychology, there's not really a first-year testing pool either. And so gathering data is a nightmare. So what me and some colleagues did is we applied for federal funding for Australia-Indonesian Institute links. So it's an institute for Australia-Indonesian to do a project in Indonesia. And what we actually did was we proposed to create a suicide prevention database, where we had a project that we were interested in, we wanted to do, but we actually approached all the stakeholders and said, hey, you know what? We have this funding, and we want to help answer some of the key suicide prevention questions in the country. So let's gather together, tell us what information is needed, we'll collect the data, and then we'll make it publicly available. And of course, then they use the data, they can lead all the interventions. So we're not leading them anywhere, we're simply empowering them to do the research that needs to be done. And we know that they'll do even a better job than we do in addressing these national challenges. And remember, meet people where they are. And we have to come to terms with the fact that some people in the Global South may not be up to date with the latest statistical developments, but may excel in many other areas. So the moment you hear somebody ask about something that we often take for granted, shut it down, because they know things that we don't even know that we don't know. And look for different opportunities to collaborate, but treat them as you would esteemed colleagues in developed research cultures. There's even a term called helicopter research, where people come in, engage, take the data, and then just head out. That has to change, because a lot of the research we're doing is actually more needed and will have more impact in these regions. We need to empower the researchers to do the research. Just because they may not have the same stats that some people have in Google Scholar or so on and so forth, it doesn't mean they're any less brilliant of a researcher. In fact, if we switch situations, they might even do much better. And this is the way that I think of it. Science, where we're supposedly the intelligent ones in society, we have to do away with a lot of these borders and realize that, you know what, we're just helping each other as good neighbors would. In fact, what a lot of people don't realize, the basis for modern academia, a lot of it came from countries we consider in the Global South. Mathematics, science, a lot of those things which predated even what we consider the foundational things of science today came from a lot of these countries. And so we need to do away with the borders. We need to do away with all of that and bring everyone to the table to come up with common solutions on how can we empower each other. Last but not least, in any scientific issue, including improving science, diversity needs to be reconceptualized as thoroughness. If I consider something diverse, I consider myself a whole. I'm complete as I am, and I'm just branching out. So there are many different types. But we need to reconceptualize it as thoroughness to understand that they have viewpoints, insights, expertise, excellence, impact that we don't have when we're in developed research countries or in developed research systems. And so we need to be thorough. If we want to create real impact in the world, we need to bring everyone to the table. And that's it. Thank you so much for attending my talk. I hope you enjoyed it. Looking forward to hearing any questions that you might have. Thank you. So the first question I'm asked is, what do you think are the most important changes needed in the way we do research? And I have 3 minutes to answer that question. So apart from literally almost quite everything, the way that we evaluate research, the way we evaluate journals, and then the fact that a lot of the way that we use prestige and so on and so forth perpetuates research inequality, I think the next step, the next feasible step that we can do in moving open science forward in the way we do research is simply developing networks, not in order to make events, but to actually empower one another, involving those in the global south. Because everyone is fighting their own battle in their own field. They're working in their specific niche of open scholarship. They're working in their specific region of open scholarship. But a lot of these people are doing it almost alone. And so apart from the large scale changes that we need a little bit later on, the policy changes, the journal changes, doing away with these different fields, making sure that we save time on grants and on publication and translation, all these sort of things are really, really important. The next step that we can do that I feel is most important is bring everyone to the table. Because fighting for a cause when you're part of a team is very different from fighting for a cause when you're alone. And in that same, we who are based in developed research systems are responsible at this time for including those in developing research systems. That's what I feel is the next step that we can do now. And then hopefully, as we work in concert, then we can make those large scale global, actually global changes that we were hoping for.